For 13 days in October 1962, the entire world held its breath, teetering on the brink of nuclear war. It's a story we all think we know. Two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, locked in a terrifying standoff over nuclear missiles secretly planted on the island of Cuba. We all remember the grainy black and white photos of missile sites, the stern face of President John F. Kennedy on TV, and the chilling fear that gripped the entire planet. It was the one moment when the hands of the doomsday clock were about to strike midnight. But the story you know, it's only half the truth. The official version of the Cuban Missile Crisis, a clean, simple tale of American resolve forcing a Soviet retreat, is a carefully constructed story. It's a version that leaves out the most critical, most dangerous, and most secret details. What if I told you the crisis wasn't just solved by big speeches and public threats, but by secret letters, frantic back-channel deals, and a lone Soviet naval officer in the dark depths of the Atlantic who refused an order to launch a nuclear torpedo? What if the public story was a convenient fiction, designed to protect reputations, while the real solution was a secret compromise that stayed hidden for decades? Today, we're uncovering the secret history of the Cuban Missile Crisis. We're exploring the hidden deals, the unsung heroes, and the backroom meetings that truly saved the world. This is what they never told you. The world on a knife's edge. To get how the world came so dangerously close to the edge, you first have to understand the fear and suspicion that defined the Cold War. The late 50s and early 60s weren't a time of peace. They were a time of a fragile, terrifying truce held together by one idea: mutually assured destruction. The world was split in two between the capitalist United States and the communist Soviet Union. An iron curtain had fallen across Europe, and both sides were in a relentless arms race, stockpiling enough nuclear weapons to destroy civilization many times over. In the White House, you had the young, charismatic John F. Kennedy. He was a president haunted by a recent failure. His administration was still stinging from the humiliation of the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, a disastrous CIA-backed attempt to overthrow Cuba's new leader, Fidel Castro. That failure didn't just embolden Castro, it pushed him straight into the arms of the Soviet Union. Now Kennedy was under huge pressure from his military advisors, the Hawks, to prove he wasn't a weak leader who could be pushed around. Thousands of miles away in the Kremlin sat Nikita Khrushchev, the boisterous and unpredictable Soviet premier. Khrushchev was driven by a mix of communist pride and a deep sense of being strategically behind. He'd look at a map and see his nation surrounded. The US had way more long-range bombers and ICBMs, and even more insultingly, the US had placed nuclear-tipped Jupiter missiles in Italy and, right on his doorstep, in Turkey. These missiles could hit major Soviet cities, including Moscow, in minutes. For Khrushchev, this was a threat he couldn't tolerate. He even once asked the American ambassador how Americans would feel if the Soviets put missiles in Mexico. This feeling of being held at gunpoint became the driving force for his next, incredibly bold move. And in Havana, you had Fidel Castro, the fiery revolutionary who brought communism just 90 miles from American shores. After the Bay of Pigs, Castro was convinced the US would try again to topple him. He desperately needed a powerful protector who could guarantee his revolution would survive. So you had this perfect storm brewing. Kennedy needed to look tough, Castro needed protection, and Khrushchev saw a brilliant two-for-one opportunity. He could defend his new Cuban ally while secretly leveling the nuclear playing field. He was going to give the Americans a taste of their own medicine. He was going to put nuclear missiles in their backyard. The stage was set for a crisis that would push humanity to the very edge of extinction. Operation Anadyr, the secret unfolds. The Soviet plan to sneak nuclear missiles into Cuba was a masterpiece of deception. The operation was so secret it was given a code name designed to fool everyone, including their own soldiers. Operation Anadyr. The Anadyr is a river in the frozen wasteland of Siberia, so Soviet soldiers assigned to the mission were issued skis, fleece-lined parkas, and winter boots, and were told they were heading to a cold, remote post. It was a brilliant fake-out. As thousands of troops and tons of military gear began moving to southern ports, any leak would point American intelligence in the exact opposite direction of their real, tropical destination, Cuba. The secrecy was total. The 40,000 soldiers involved were only allowed on the decks of the transport ships at night. The ship's captains weren't even told their final destination. They were given sealed envelopes to be opened only once they were far out at sea. To complete the illusion, civilian trucks and farm equipment were placed on the top decks, making it look like the ships were just carrying agricultural aid. It was a classic example of what the Russians call maskirovka, a military doctrine of deception designed to completely mislead your enemy. Khrushchev's goal was audacious: get medium and intermediate range ballistic missiles fully operational in Cuba before the United States even knew what was happening. And for months it worked. The CIA got a few scattered reports of weird activity in Cuba, but the information was patchy. Soviet diplomats, including their ambassador in Washington, Anatoly Dobrinin, flatly denied any plans to place offensive weapons on the island. They swore all their military aid was purely defensive. But you can't hide a nuclear missile base for long. By the fall of 1962, the evidence was getting too hard to ignore. The smoking gun came on October 14, 1962. A high-altitude American U-2 spy plane, flown by Major Richard Heiser, zipped over the Cuban countryside. When the film was developed, the images were shocking. There, in the fields of San Cristobal, were the unmistakable signs of a Soviet SS-4 medium-range ballistic missile site being built. From that launch pad just 90 miles off the coast of Florida, these nuclear missiles could strike Washington, D.C., Dallas, or almost any major city in the southeastern United States in minutes. The entire strategic balance of power was about to change overnight. On the morning of October 16th, the photos were slapped down on President Kennedy's desk. The secret was out. The crisis had begun. Kennedy immediately pulled together a small secret group of his most trusted advisors. This group would become known as ExComm. For the next 13 days, they would meet in secret, debating and arguing over a decision that could mean life or death for hundreds of millions of people. The clock was ticking. Every single day, the missiles in Cuba got closer to being ready to fire. The 13 days, a chronological thriller. What followed that discovery was a 13-day spiral of tension that is now seen as the single most dangerous moment in all of human history. Inside the secret meetings of ExComm, the air was thick with anxiety. The first 5 days were a fierce debate. The options were brutal. On one side, you had the military leaders, the Joint Chiefs of Staff. They argued for an immediate massive airstrike to destroy the missile sites, followed by a full-scale invasion of Cuba. General Curtis LeMay, the Air Force Chief of Staff, bluntly told Kennedy that a blockade was almost as bad as the appeasement at Munich. On the other side were the doves like Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara and the president's brother Robert Kennedy. They argued that a surprise military strike was not only morally wrong, calling it a Pearl Harbor in reverse, but also incredibly risky. What if they missed a missile? What if the Soviets already had tactical nukes on the island, ready to use against an invading force? An attack could trigger a chain reaction that would lead straight to nuclear war. McNamara pushed for a naval blockade, which he carefully called a quarantine to make it sound less like an act of war. This would stop more weapons from reaching Cuba and buy both sides time to negotiate. Kennedy was caught in the middle. He was wary of his military advisors, especially after they pushed him into the Bay of Pigs disaster. But he also knew he couldn't do nothing. After days of agonizing debate, Kennedy made his choice. He went for the middle path, the naval quarantine. On the evening of October 22nd, he went on national television and revealed the crisis to a stunned world. His words were chilling. He announced the discovery of the missiles, showed the photos, and declared that any nuclear missile launched from Cuba would be seen as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, demanding a full nuclear response. The world was now officially on high alert. U.S. forces went to DEFCON 3. Across America, fear took over. People hoarded food and school kids practiced duck and cover drills, a terrifyingly useless defense against nuclear fire. The quarantine line was drawn, a ring of American warships around Cuba, waiting, The whole world watched. Would the Soviet ships challenge the blockade? The first test came, and thankfully, several Soviet ships heading for the quarantine zone either stopped dead in the water or turned back. Secretary of State Dean Rusk famously whispered, "We're eyeball to eyeball, and I think the other fellow just blinked." But the crisis was far from over. Construction on the missile sites in Cuba was speeding up. At the United Nations, U.S. Ambassador Adlai Stevenson dramatically confronted his Soviet counterpart, Valerian Zorin. Zorin, who had probably been kept in the dark by his own government, repeatedly denied the missiles existed. Stevenson, with the U-2 photos on giant easels, delivered one of the most famous lines of the Cold War. "Do you, Ambassador Zorin, deny that the USSR has placed and is placing medium and intermediate range missiles in sites in Cuba? Yes or no?" When Zorin tried to deflect, Stevenson shot back, "I am prepared to wait for my answer until hell freezes over." It was a huge PR win, but it didn't remove a single missile. Then on Friday, October 26th, a strange glimmer of hope. A KGB officer approached ABC News correspondent John Scali and floated a deal. The Soviets removed the missiles in exchange for a public U.S. promise not to invade Cuba. Was it real? Later that day, a much more direct message arrived at the White House. It was a long, rambling, and deeply emotional letter sent secretly from Khrushchev himself. It wasn't a formal diplomatic note, it was a personal plea. He wrote about the horrors of war and proposed the same basic deal: missile removal for a non-invasion guarantee. ExComm went to bed Friday night feeling cautiously optimistic. Maybe the worst was over. They were wrong. The next day would be the darkest of them all. Black Saturday, the brink of Armageddon. The hope from Friday night was obliterated on the morning of Saturday, October 27. This one day, Black Saturday, was the day the world came closer than ever to nuclear war. It started with a confusing twist. A new public message came from Moscow. This second letter from Khrushchev was completely different. It was harsh, formal, and demanding. It added a new condition. The Soviets would only remove their missiles from Cuba if the US removed its Jupiter missiles from Turkey. This threw ExComm into chaos. Was the Kremlin divided? Had Khrushchev been overruled by hardliners? Trading away the Jupiter missiles publicly was a non-starter. It would look like weakness and could shatter the NATO alliance. The Hawks renewed their calls for immediate military action, and then, as they debated, the situation escalated. At midday, news came that a U-2 spy plane had been shot down over Cuba by a Soviet missile. The pilot, Major Rudolf Anderson Jr., was killed. This was a direct act of war. Military protocol was clear. If a U-2 is shot down, the missile site that fired it must be destroyed immediately. The Joint Chiefs unanimously recommended a retaliatory airstrike for Monday morning. Kennedy now faced an impossible choice. If he followed their advice, war was almost certain. If he did nothing, he'd look weak. The path to peace was vanishing. But what nobody in the White House knew was that an even more dangerous drama was playing out hundreds of feet beneath the Atlantic. A Soviet submarine, B-59, was hiding near the quarantine line. It had been out of contact with Moscow for days and its batteries were dying. An American naval fleet found B-59 and started dropping small, non-lethal, signaling depth charges to try and force it to the surface. Inside the sweltering, cramped submarine, the crew didn't know these were just signals. The temperature was over 120 degrees, the air was foul, and explosions were shaking their ship. The captain, Valentin Savitsky, was convinced they were under attack. He thought World War III had already started, and B-59, unbeknownst to the Americans, carried a special weapon, a nuclear-tipped torpedo with the same power as the Hiroshima bomb. To launch it, 3 senior officers had to agree. The captain gave the order, arm the torpedo and fire. The political officer agreed. That was 2 out of 3. The fate of the world came down to one man, Vasily Arkhipov. Arkhipov was the flotilla commander, and his approval was also required. Surrounded by chaos and believing they were about to die, Arkhipov stayed calm. He argued against the launch. An intense fight broke out in the control room, but Arkhipov would not back down. He refused to give his authorization. He talked the captain down, persuading him to surface the submarine and wait for orders. A single man deep in the ocean, cut off from everything, made a choice that stopped a naval skirmish from becoming a nuclear apocalypse. If that torpedo had been fired, the USS Randolph and its thousands of sailors would have been instantly vaporized, triggering a massive and final nuclear war. The secret deal that saved the world. Back in Washington, as dusk fell on Black Saturday, the situation looked bleak. Kennedy was being pushed toward war, and the Soviets had offered a deal that seemed politically impossible. It was in this moment of extreme danger that Kennedy's team came up with a brilliant, secret strategy. It was a move later called the trollop ploy, basically pretending you only heard the part of an offer that you like. They decided to just ignore the second, harsher letter from Moscow. They would act like it never existed. Instead, they would publicly respond only to the first, friendlier letter, the one that only asked for a non-invasion promise. This was a public show of goodwill, a way to let Khrushchev back down without being publicly humiliated. But that was only half of it. The other, more critical half, was done in total secrecy. That night, Robert Kennedy was sent to the Soviet embassy for a secret meeting with Ambassador Dobrynin. This was the back channel that would truly end the crisis. In that meeting, RFK delivered the real message. He confirmed the public deal. The U.S. would pledge not to invade Cuba if the missiles were removed. But then he made the secret concession. He gave Dobrynin a quiet, verbal promise. He said that the Jupiter missiles in Turkey, the ones at the heart of the second Soviet demand, would be removed. But he stressed this could not be a public trade. It couldn't be part of the official deal, because that would wreck the NATO alliance and destroy the president politically. RFK explained that the missiles were obsolete anyway and were going to be removed soon. He promised they would be gone in a few months, but this part of the deal had to remain an absolute secret. This was the solution. It was a diplomatic masterpiece that let both leaders get what they needed while saving face. Kennedy could publicly claim a huge victory, having stood firm and forced the Soviets to back down. And Khrushchev could privately tell the hardliners in the Kremlin that he'd not only saved Cuba, but had also gotten the American missiles off their border. It was a deal that allowed both sides to declare victory, a secret compromise built on a public fiction. The Cuban Missile Crisis is a powerful reminder that history is always more complex than the version we learn in school. It's the secret deals and the hidden stories that truly shape our world. So what do you think? Did Kennedy make the right choice with this secret deal? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you love digging into the stories they never told you, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss what we uncover next. Conclusion. On the morning of Sunday, October 28th, the world woke up to incredible news. Radio Moscow announced that the Soviet Union had decided to dismantle its offensive weapons in Cuba and send them home. The crisis was over. A massive collective sigh of relief echoed around the globe. The nightmare had ended. Publicly, it looked like a stunning, clean victory for President Kennedy. It seemed his tough stance had forced the Soviets into a total retreat. The story of the secret missile trade stayed hidden for years, known only to a tiny handful of people. And true to Robert Kennedy's word, a few months later, in April 1963, the Jupiter missiles were quietly removed from Turkey and Italy. It was spun as a routine modernization of NATO's arsenal. The secret held. The crisis changed the Cold War. Kennedy's reputation soared, but for Khrushchev, the public perception of backing down damaged his prestige, and he was forced from power less than 2 years later. But the biggest legacy of the crisis was the terrifying realization of how close the superpowers had come to destroying each other. It sobered up both Washington and Moscow. Soon after, the famous hotline was set up between the two capitals to make sure leaders could talk directly in a future crisis. It also led to the first major arms control deal, the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. The official story of the Cuban Missile Crisis is one of tough guys in a standoff. But the secret history, what they never told you, is a far more complex and human story. It shows us that sometimes the path away from the abyss isn't forged in public displays of strength, but in quiet, secret acts of diplomacy, in back-channel meetings, and in the incredible courage of a few people who, when faced with the end of the world, chose to pull us back from the brink.